Namihi nui kia koto katua, talofa lava, sawubona, salam. My name is Mershen Pillay. I'm a South African, and just a little bit about myself. I was born and shaped in the crucible of apartheid and post-apartheid struggle, but now I'm living and working in Aotearoa, New Zealand, affiliated with the University of KwaZulu-Natal in South Africa and Massey University. So I carry in my body what it means to grow up in a country where your knowledge, your language, your very presence was legislated as inferior, and what it means to watch that country try imperfectly, stubbornly, beautifully to build something else. So that history is why I do this work, and it's also why I feel the weight of today particularly. So before we begin, I want to name where we are in the calendar. This past Friday was Eid al-Fitr, the end of Ramadan, the festival of breaking the fast. It is a day of celebration, of gratitude, of community, and of a truly unreasonable amount of food usually. And today, which is Sunday in Aotearoa, or Saturday for most of the other people are not who have the decency to be in a proper time zone. And th this day is the last day of the extended Eid holidays, the periods across much of the Muslim world. And many of our whānau are still gathered with family. They're still in the warmth of that celebration. So to everyone who has been marking this Eid this weekend and to those who are still in it, Eid Mubarak. We're glad you were here and we are glad you made time for this. And especially to our participants who are celebrating Eid as well. Um, but I want to hold this moment with honesty. This Eid, as for many of our whānau, our family across this world, has been marked under conditions that make celebration very complicated. In Gaza, families have been marking Eid under bombardment and blockade. In Sudan, in Kashmir, in Uyghur communities in Xinjiang, people have been celebrating through grief, through rubble, through absence. And I would be remiss not to name what has been broken open this weekend. So while Eid celebrations were still underway on Saturday on the eve of Nowruz, the Persian New Year, a night when millions of Iranian families traditionally light fires and gather around tables to mark new beginnings, the US launched military strikes on Iran. On New Year's Eve, a night of celebration for one people turned into a night of strikes by another. So whatever your politics, whatever your analysis of what led here, we are watching a region being pulled towards the edge of something very serious, while much of the world is still mid-celebration. We name it, we do not look away. But I want to say this clearly. What I'm describing is not a Muslim problem or Middle Eastern problem or someone else's problem. These are crises of power, of colonialism, of who gets to decide whose land is dispensable, whose life is a footnote, whose sovereignty is negotiable. And those are precisely the questions this panel will wrestle with today. So we begin not despite the weight of the world, but because of it. I'm going to open us or clear the space with a karakia. So, tuia ki runga, tuia ki raro, tuia ki roto, tuia ki waho, tuia te here tangata, tuturio fiti, whakamoa ki a tina, homie, hui, taikie. For those of you who don't understand Te Reo Māori, this is basically a karakia, a practice of opening or clearing the space for us to talk. And it said basically stitch, unite the celestial energies to the terrestrial energies within and without, bind the kinship strands of humanity, permanent, consistent are the fibers of light, draw these matters to a single point and give them substance. The wisdom is bound, it collects, it is held. So you are in the right place, and there's a little bit of housekeeping here. This is the Critical Thinking from the Global South session, which is day 2, session 1, part of Te Tiriti-based futures and anti-racism conference. On your screen, you should see our community code. Please take a moment with it. This is the agreement that holds the space together, and yes, we ask you to abide by it. Please use the chat to connect with other participants, and please do connect with us. We're really keen on engaging with you. This is part of the joy of these sessions. For questions to the panel, please use the Q&A function rather than the chat so that our moderator can track them and get the good ones to me. If we do not get your questions, it is not because we don't love you, it's because we only have 2 hours and already talk too much. So live captions are running. If you need any other accessibility support, please let us know in the chat. And I'm going to introduce the panel. And unfortunately, we have lost a speaker this morning who was advertised, and mention them by name and just a brief overview. And hopefully we can have contributions later on in asynchronous chat versions. So I think, we've got a bit of an extraordinary group of people that I'm going to introduce. So pair people. And I say this not because I'm required to, I say it because I've read their work. And their work has made me uncomfortable in exactly the ways good scholarship should do. First up is Leon Moosavi, and he will tell you a little bit more about himself, but just by way of a quick introduction, Leon is a sociologist whose work interrogates the politics of knowledge production in the global South, asking with characteristic sharpness. I've been in quite a few sessions with Leon in it and loved it, very entertaining. He asks about who gets cited, who gets read, and who gets to define what counts as theory. His work on the Global South lens challenges the monopoly that Western academia holds over what counts as legitimate knowledge. He also has the distinction of being one of the few people who can make citation politics feel genuinely urgent, which if you have ever been on the receiving end of a peer review that tells you your references are too regional, you will understand it's a non-trivial achievement. So Leon is joining us from the United Kingdom. Welcome. And Eid Mubarak to you as well. Gabriela Veronelli is a philosopher and a decolonial scholar whose research asks one of the most fundamental questions you can ask. What does it mean to have a language? And what happens when coloniality decides whether your language counts? Her work on the coloniality of language goes to the roots of who gets to make sense, who gets to be heard, and how the very structure of linguistic recognition has been shaped by colonial power. She's currently working with bilingual Latina students in the Chicagoland area, which means she's not just theorizing about these questions, she's living them. Gabriela is joining us from Chicago. We would have had Aliu Yusuf present with us, and like I said, unfortunately, he was unable to join us. Aliu is a TEDx speaker, strategic communications leader, and a narrative strategist, and I'm sure that Aliu will be able to contribute to questions and discussions in the asynchronous part of this recorded presentation when it gets there. So I'm going to start our little panel discussion. We have a few questions to anchor our conversation today, and they are starting points, not fences. So push back on them, reshape them, argue with us, argue with each other. The goal is not to get a tidy conclusion. The goal is to get honest, generative fight. So the first question, I'm going to pose this in terms of it's about the global South, and it's about naming the world we live in. So global South or majority world, the term global South has become almost fashionable, but does it obscure more than it reveals? What does it mean to reclaim the reframing of the majority world in a more honest, more radical starting point for decolonial thought? Now I'm going to push us with Leon to start off. Leon, as I've said, you have written carefully about what we gain and what we lose in this language. And you've coined the idea of a global South lens as a methodological tool. But does the tool risk becoming a label when the global South is everywhere? Does it stop meaning anything? So maybe just to kick us off into thinking through those thoughts.
Thanks, Mershen. Really appreciate that introduction. It's very kind of you to say what you said. And thank you to all of the organizers and everyone who's behind the scenes. There's been a lot of people working on putting this together for several months now. And to be honest, I haven't seen an event which has been, as thoroughly prepared and so much thought has gone into it. So I just congratulate all the organizers for what you've done. It's really an incredible and a huge undertaking, but you're doing something which is extremely valuable, which is you're taking the initiative. And what I've learned in life, and you all know this already, is that nothing good happens without somebody taking the initiative. And in fact, there is so much potential in various communities, in various places in the world. But unfortunately, one of the reasons that we're not always reaching our potential, I think, that we can talk about discrimination and structures and bombs, as someone as Mershen just referred to. There are, of course, external factors, but sometimes it's also from lack of initiative on our own part, but the organizers of this conference are showing us that we stand up and we do what we can and we try to make things happen. We try to make conversations happen. We try to, do whatever activism you're all doing and trying to make a positive contribution. And as they say, trying to leave the world a better place than it was when we entered. And I think everyone who's here, who's present today, you're doing the same thing as well. You're giving up your time to learn and to think and to discuss and to share ideas. And I really liked the rules that they had at the beginning. And one of the rules said something like, we as individuals might not know everything, but collectively we know quite a lot. And I love that concept. And I think that's the spirit in which I hope this event will take place, where we share ideas, but we don't know everything, and we sometimes are wrong, and we sometimes change our opinions, even on the same day, even in the same session. So we're just trying to learn together here. So in terms of what you raised about this terminology to do with Global South, you know, um, for me, this issue is both important and not important. And it's important because the terms that we use affect the way that we look at the world and the way that we understand what's going on in the world. It affects who we see and who we understand as being in existence, and it affects who we overlook and who becomes invisible. So it's really important to think carefully about language, because if we don't think carefully about language, the representation that we give of the world that exists will not be as precise and as accurate and as rich as it could be if we put thought into the language that we use. But like I said, this question of language and global south versus, some people say global majority. In the past, people talked about third world. That was fashionable at one point. Some people talk about post-colonial societies. Some talk about the metropole and the periphery and the semi-periphery. There's many different ways of talking about these spatial arrangements. At the same time, as we know, and this applies to many other discussions about terminology, there's never going to be a perfect term. There's always going to be a limitation in terms of the language that we use and the terminologies that we use. I always give the example because I used to do a lot more writing about Islamophobia, and I still do to some extent, but there's a lot of debate about the term Islamophobia. Is Islamophobia the right term, the wrong term, the good term, the bad term? Should we call it anti-Muslim hatred? Should we call it anti-Muslim racism? Should we call it Muslimophobia? So there's always these debates, and it's important, and we have these debates because maybe something, we learn something from changing term. And the same thing happens when people talk about xenophobia. Is it a good term? Anti-Semitism, is it the right term? Is there a more accurate term? And we can talk about even sexism, misogyny, racism, even. The word racism is a term that's been debated. Like, is it a good term? Like, is it the best term? Sometimes people want to suggest alternatives for what is going on. So these debates are important in one sense. But what bothers me about these debates is that I worry that sometimes these debates basically act as a distraction from what is potentially more important. And what is more important, of course, is to tackle those things, to challenge those things. So when we say like the global south, global north, of course, it's an inadequate terminology because, as we know, in the global south, there is like even you take Australia, for example, since I think many of you are in that region. In Australia, there are some people who are succeeding or beneficiaries of colonialism or global inequality. And then there are some people who are not. And then we know in other countries, like say Indonesia, for example, not too far away, we know that the same thing also applies, even though more people might be in one category or the other. So we know that there's complexities within each society, but we know that overall there's this bigger picture that we want to try and understand in terms of the fact that basically, in a nutshell, there is inequalities on a global level, and those inequalities might be in terms of resources and economics, but it might also be in terms of political power. It might also be in terms of the worth that is ascribed to the bodies that come from those places. It might be in terms of the cultures or the religions or the languages that also originate in different places. So what's more important to me than trying to say, is it north south? Is it, periphery? Is it, semi-periphery? Like, what is the best terminology? For me, the more important thing is, right, we know we've got a problem. We try our best to describe that problem, but what are we going to do about it? What can we do about it? Can we do anything about it? Can we at least document it? Can we at least raise awareness of it? And I'm not sure where everyone's from in terms of like what you're doing in your life and what your job is, or what you're, if you're students, or maybe you're activist, or maybe you're raising a family, or maybe doing many, many things. But I guess within our own spheres, we all have some potential to either understand things ourselves or maybe to share that knowledge with other people, maybe to do something in terms of lobbying towards people who might have power, trying to convince them of the importance of these things, maybe in terms of charity, giving charitable donations, maybe in terms of advising or mentoring people who haven't been able to succeed in the way that they might have been able to if it wasn't for those global inequalities. So I'm sorry to speak a lot. I guess what I'm trying to say in summary before I hand over to another colleague is I'm basically trying to say that let's really try to recognize the importance of terminology, but let's also remind ourselves that what's potentially, anyway, to me, more important is to say, right, we know that there are winners. I sometimes call it winners and losers of colonialism, or those who've done better and those who've done worse as a result of colonialism. And then let's see, what are we going to do about that? Are we happy with that? Are we comfortable with that? And the difficulty there, one last thing, I'm sorry, I can rant on for so long, I'm sorry for that. But the difficulty, what arises, and this is something I've tried to capture in my own writing, is that when you think about it in these terms of winners and losers, or those who have privilege and those who have disadvantage or who do not have the privilege, suddenly you start to see it's not clear cut that you can say just because somebody is from, like, one colleague was joining us from Nigeria, just because somebody's from Nigeria means that they are disadvantaged, because we know that there are some people in Nigeria who have succeeded or excelled in this global sort of the geopolitical neoliberal global economy. So it's not as simple as that. And so that's why, sometimes this type of terminology, which is not just as crude as South and North, might help us to recognize the complexity of the situation. Because I've been born and raised in the UK, for example, but I've met people from what we call the global South, many people in universities, especially from the global South, whose English is better than mine, whose education is better than mine, whose cultural capital, meaning, let's say, to put that another way, whose manners, whose conversational skills, whose ability to understand the etiquette of, let's call it elitism, is better than mine. And why is it better than mine? Because the education that they had even though they're from the global South, it was a type of elite, privileged, prestigious, private kind of education, which schooled them in the language of what we might call coloniality or colonialism or global Western hegemony. And that gave them a certain type of advantage and a certain type of, like as I said, cultural capital and other types of capital, which exceeded what someone like myself, who was born and raised in the global North, was able to attain. I'm not saying that I'm disadvantaged, or I'm not saying that I'm excluded or marginal or peripheral. I have many privileges. And one of them is the passport, for example. This is a big thing that we need to talk about, the passport, because it's so different, so strange that we live in a world where the worth of someone's ability to travel is determined on the document that they possess. It's a very strange, and it's a very, we mentioned apartheid there. This is, I'm not sure if I can call it apartheid. I don't want to like disrespect what that actual apartheid in South Africa and other places was like, but it's a kind of apartheid, or it resembles apartheid, the global passport order that we have in terms of, you have this card, you get to go easily. You have another card, you have to pay. You have to go for an interview. You get rejected outright. So I do have that privilege in the sense that I'm a British citizen, but then there might be people in the global South who have another type of privilege, and that's why we need that complexity and the nuance when trying to understand global inequality. So I'm sorry I spoke so much, and I'm sorry if it doesn't make sense, but I hope something I said might have been beneficial, and I'll pass back over to Mershen.
Thank you, Leon. I think that is very rich response, lots of beautiful concepts for us to think about. I do respect your perspective on the semantic masturbation that putting a new term in our discourse might do for us versus a very pragmatic orientation to let's just do this then, no matter what we call ourselves. But I think Gabriela might have some interesting things to say around words and what they might mean. And so from a philosophy of language perspective, Gabriela, what does it mean when the vocab of resistance gets absorbed by the institutions it was meant to challenge? So is there a version of Global South that already has been domesticated, or any other thoughts you might have on what Leon said and just the concept itself?
Yeah, I when we were discussing a little bit earlier, I was asking you for the history of the term majority word, and I don't know if everybody knows this, but as much as I agree that, of course, the who controls the word is a question of power, I, as a philosopher, I want to concentrate in the question at point that has to do with the term global south. And for me, and I, the way I have used it and the way, like, Latin American decolonial thought uses the global south is not the same as south. It's not really a geographical location as Leon was criticizing it, but more and similar to especially what Leon say at the end regarding winners and losers of colonization. It's more a term that describes ontological and epistemological locations in the departing or receiving end of colonialism. So when you were saying, Leon, and you're locating yourself within the UK, you can see that there, for me, the global south also talks about the south in the north, right? So we cease to see the political geography installed by colonialism, no, the nation state under fictions of homogeneity, So, but for me, the term global south already does that and has been used in the colonial Latin American theory as such, right? Like connected to socioeconomic and social political characteristic, yes, but most deeply connected with colonization. So it was an important moment where the subjectivity of the colonized came up and had a voice in the theoretical and political debates in Latin America and Latina discussions in the Americas regarding colonialism. So the global south for me came from that conversation. So it's a term that I embrace. For example, 2 years ago, I helped to edit this volume on teaching English in Latin America, right? Like English teachers taking up and criticizing the curricula, the programs that usually come from the UK, right? Like from Cambridge School, and they wanted to call it the South Speaks Back, right? Like taking the Star Wars. So it's like the counter empire, right? Like so, and there, I understand that whenever we use a term to address a very different realities, right? There's a lot of dangers, right? Dangers of generalizing, dangers of homogenizing, of totalizing realities that are in their receiving end of colonialism, nonetheless very, very different. So I understand how to talk about global south may have that challenge, right? Like to keep the focus on its heterogeneity, right? Like when it's a term like think from below, and to emphasize again the ontological and epistemic locations of the global south. So right now, for example, where I live in Chicago, and the anti-immigrant, anti-Latin American, anti-brown people politics are so strong, right? Like you can think of Chicago and certain parts of Chicago being harassed and terrorized by ICE as parts of the South. So that's how I have used the term, and I think it and as I said before, I know maybe you can discuss a little bit what you see of the majority word term as being something to embrace, right? Like speaking of locations in a different way. And at the same time, these are all terminologies that on the end are saying it's not that one comes and leaves, right? Like it's vocabulary that all very radical scholars are using, so they definitely converse with one another. Different from when I think the third war, right? Like the third war was a term imposed in line with the first and second word of the World War II. And while, for me at least, Global South is a term of identity. And let me stop there.
So from what you're saying in terms of terms, use of terms, it helps us to symbolize where we belong. And I really take that point on as someone from the Global South. But that the point that you're raising, which I'm finding particularly seductive as something to think about, is it's been spoken about before for a variety of different organizations for how strategic essentialism, which is Gayatri Spivak's term around thinking about identity and using it in ways that allows for that collective identity to fight against something. Is important as well. So I like that you've raised that, and I think it is important looking at how people can cohere around it. Granted that we don't, that especially outsiders, and I'll use that term very carefully, perceive that essentialist identity and what they do with it. And so that even engaging it within a framework of othering might be something we'd have to consider carefully for how we use it ourselves. But thank you for raising those points, Gabriela. I think they've been really useful for us to think through the term. And of course, not an easy outcome. Do we continue? How do we engage it? There's so many. And I think as academics, it really gets people thinking around that differently, because of course there are practical, pragmatic implications, like what Leon has raised earlier on as well for the work. I was thinking a little bit more around issues, and this is still sticking on the topic here, but looking at when we're thinking about communication, when we're thinking about telling the story. So in our work as academics, as non-academics, as activists, however we engage this. So when you tell the story of the majority world, the Global South, to audiences who have been, say, trained to see it as the South, what framing do you reach for and why? And I think that's something we really need to think about. Any further thoughts on that? Because there's still a word you would use to describe that space and those people. How do we frame that at a pragmatic level? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think that I like that your question is about the people, right? Like, because at the end, these are all terms to name people and what people do, including naming. So in my own work, I think in terms of colonized, thinking on the long duration of what Quijano has called coloniality. And that is a term that I think that it can work as a meta, because coloniality is something we all experience, but also understanding its local manifestations. So it has that infra-political level as well that matters to us, right? Like, not because of the dangers of generalizing and essentializing, right, and not and reproducing some of the silence mechanisms that we are trying to challenge. So and as you was reminding us of how we use it, right? Like also at the same time taking a moment to realize how one fits within the history of that term and how it's seen by other people, right? Like, so maybe what I'm trying to emphasize is that the dialogical making of sense of terms. But yes, to cut it short, in terms of terminology, that's the one that I have most used in my work and in my teaching. And it's resisted, right? Like, because people do think of colonialism as something of the past, right? And to think it as present and ongoing, but also to allow to connect the now with the past and see the process of production, of the coloniality, of racialization, of a patriarchy, right? Like, it's a long-term process that rivets today and it ripples today. And you know, that nothing, when we say decolonial, right? Like, it's a word as old as colonial, right? Like Enrique Dussel used to say, resistance is as old as oppression, right? Like, so always remembering that. Also, for me, that is what all the framework of coloniality has allowed me to think and about, right? Like, and in that long-term process that puts us in connection, not only with each other in these different locales that we are living of coloniality now, you know, in 2026, in this moment of nativism and right-wing and militarization, but also in the connections with the past. And why is that important? Because it is that possibility of seeing ourselves large, right? Like Susa Santos says, right? Like, when we see ourselves large, is that we can really see alternatives, right? And so the places for us to look for new conversations like the one we are having now, right? Like, it allows us to have something in common, understanding that we are not the same, right? And that difference matter. But, or, you know, like Audre Lorde used to say, is the non-dominant difference that we celebrate, right? So, but like, again, for me, coloniality and colonized allows that large sense of ourselves when we are naming.
The temporal spatial localization of that concept of coloniality, beautiful, love it. And I think it gives us a viable alternative to looking at a geographical location identity. Leon, any final thoughts on this before we move on to our next topic?
Well, you are making me think here, which is what you said at the outset we're going to do for each other. So I think another term which I probably use quite frequently or have in the past is the binary or the dichotomy of West and non-West. And I think I was trying to think, like, why do I think in those terms or speak in those terms? And I think there's two reasons. One reason is because Edward Said's work has been very influential for me, and those of you who are familiar with his work will know that he talked about Orientalism, and Orientalism is referring to the Orient, which, you know, nowadays we might refer more commonly to as the non-West. And the opposite is supposedly the Occident, or now what we would might refer to as the West. So his framing and his theory, which is a very fundamental theory in a lot of post-colonial scholarship, um, is really about thinking about how historically over centuries, various people who had power and influence created an impression that the world can be divided into, you could say, good and evil, or into superior and inferior, into civilized and uncivilized, into progressive and backward, or enlightened and barbaric. And this, according to Edward Said's, you know, analysis, can be was historically projected onto the Occident and the Orient, with the Orient seen, or the non-West seen, as the one that is inferior, lacking, dangerous, you know, backward and fixed and static and stagnant. And so that had a big influence, I suppose, on how I thought about the world that we live in. But there's some, I don't know, like, if people have discussed this much in the past, but there's some interesting things then to build on that in terms of thinking about the place of Latin America, which we've heard about already, because there is this question that comes up, and it comes up when people talk about decolonial theory or decoloniality, about what is the place of Latin America, because is it Western? Is it not Western because of the culture or the language or the religion or the people or the demography of the people, depending on which country we're talking about, the way that people are racialized and so on. So that's why I think Global South came to supersede the idea of the West and the non-West, because the Global South and the language of the Global South allows us to integrate Latin America into an idea of a broader, excluded, marginalized, subjugated periphery than when we think in terms of West and non-West. And the second thing that I was going to say, because I said there was two reasons why I think West non-West has been important to me. The second reason I think might be because I am, like many of us here, somebody whose, adult life has been strongly influenced by the war on terror and the post 9/11 landscape and the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan and whatever else has happened since then. And as you'll know, those of you who are familiar with this era, you'll know that the language of that era was very much about Western civilization and the West being supposedly under attack and Western civilization having to, according to those who believe in that kind of stuff, stand up and defend itself. And, there's this supposed like Islamic threat coming from the non-West or maybe the Middle East, Africa, Asia. And this, in that language of that rhetoric of the war on terror, it was a kind of a clash of civilizations. And so the politicians and many academics and other commentators really fed further into this narrative that, there's a clash of civilizations between the West and the non-West. There's still actors making that case today. There's still people mapping that same, what we would call Orientalist projection onto the world. And those of us who live in the West, for example, and maybe even in other places, we spend our life, or some of us who try, whether a little bit or a lot, trying to dismantle this construction of West versus non-West by trying to say, actually, we've got a lot in common. We've got a lot of similar struggles. We can be united. We can work together. There's a lot of things we can, succeed in together. We shouldn't be, believing that in the stereotypes that exist about one another, but we should be building bridges. And so a lot of people who, belong to both of those communities, and in this case, I will say, like, for example, British Muslims or European Muslims, you might say, they're often living their existence very conscious of this construction of this binary division, and they're often trying, whether it's in their immediate locality like with their colleagues, or even on a grander level in terms of trying to join protests and be activists, they're trying to dismantle this historical construct that tells us the world can be divided into two places, one which is good and one which is bad. And so going back to this thing of global south versus global north, or west versus non-west, while we do need to recognize that the world has created these hierarchies, I think, and I'm not sure if this is what you were alluding to, we need to be a little bit cautious, because sometimes reinforcing these binaries, and this is one of the critiques that people level, by the way, especially colleagues in South Africa, I've heard them saying this, to do with the whole Latin American decolonial school, is that they worry that what we might do theoretically is we might reinforce a colonial logic which tells us that the world is based on two camps and you're either this camp or that camp, and we might just, instead of dismantling this simplistic categorization, we might reinforce it, which might lead to, instead of denigrating the global south, we might end up romanticizing the global south. And some people are worried about this because, of course, there are injustices and problems also in the global south. And if we fall into that trap, we might overlook those things instead of challenging those things that we should also be talking about. So I hope that makes sense. And there's some more thoughts. And again, I apologize because I am speaking more than I should be.
But all wise words for us to listen to, I would say, Leon and Gabriela. Just looking and thinking through the dangers of perpetuating that binary is really important. So thank you for raising all these issues. Lots for us to think around the use of a term. Who knew we could make so much up about a word, hey? Or a term. I'm going to shift direction a little bit, and I have noticed the question in the Q&A. We're going to come back to that a little bit later. Um, so this is changing a little bit around looking at who decides what counts as knowledge. So whose knowledge counts and who gets to say so? How do dominant knowledge systems continue to set the rules of the game? And what does it take to think seriously outside or against those rules? So I'm going to ask Leon, because this is, and I know you say you talk too much, but this is something you have written about, the way in which the global South scholars are read as data rather than as theorists, often as providers of case studies rather than generators of theory. So how do we change that? And honestly, is the academy even a space where that change can happen? Thoughts
Mm.
on that?
Well, look, this is an extremely important issue. And it's quite sad actually when you actually think about it. But what we know is that, by the way, I'm sorry, I'm not looking at the camera because I can see myself. That's why I'm looking around because all I can see is a big picture of myself. And I'm like talking to myself in the camera. So I'm sorry I'm not like making eye contact with you because I know that's usually better. I'm trying to avoid looking at myself and my shiny bald head. But anyway, so right, I'm going to try and look at the camera so it might be more engaging. I'm focusing now. So look, right, there's a big problem here, right? And the problem is that we live in a world where that not all people are valued in the same way, right? We know this. We know this very clearly, and we've accepted it as a norm, but it shouldn't be a norm. We know that there are people, for example, I don't know where everyone's living, right? But in most cities in the world, if you're in a city, unfortunately, there are homeless people, right? And we know that when a homeless person maybe talks to you, if that happens to you, sadly to say, many of us, including those of us who are progressive and open-minded and educated and believe in social justice, many of us wish to get away from that homeless person as quickly as possible. We look at them as though they are a burden or dirty or we don't want anything to do with them, basically. Now, this is a shame because who is to say that that homeless person isn't more knowledgeable than you, more educated than you, more enlightened, more wise? Maybe they got something to share with you. Maybe they could be a great influence in your life. But of course, our instinct, because of maybe the way we're raised or the culture we're from, tells us that these kind of people, these kind of how can I put it, undesirable people, stigmatized people, should just basically be shunned, right? Now, this is sad because even those people who are also shunned, and maybe those people who talk about being shunned on account of their identity, might still engage in this kind of behavior. Now, that's one example of a community who are shunned, but there are many other communities that are shunned, and often this can be along the lines of nationality, race, language, like we heard about, the language that you speak, gender, age, class, and many other, caste in some contexts. It could be tribe. There's many ways, right, in many different contexts. And this is a problem because why should it be like that? It shouldn't be like that. We're supposed to be willing to listen to people based on the merit of their insight, their ability, what they have to offer, to give them a chance to speak and to try and understand what they're saying. But what happens, and I can only give you best example from the university, what happens is that um, we basically in almost all disciplines, right? In almost all disciplines, historically, and many of you probably already know this, the canon, as we call it, the stuff that gets taught, the stuff that the students get told, this is the most important thing, tends to be from a very small corner of the world, which tends to be Western Europe, maybe North America, depending on the discipline and the time the discipline was developed. But lots of other contributions that have been offered around the world are not acknowledged. About half an hour ago, I was watching TV. It's Saturday night here in the UK. I know some of you are in other time zones. I was watching my TV just then, and there was a TV program. It was about Egypt, and it was about like the pyramids and these excavations and the tombs and things. And it was in the TV program, which I thought was quite interesting. They were saying that the problem of the photographs that were taken of the exhibition gave the impression that the European explorers, or anthropologists, whatever you call them, excavators, archaeologists, it gave the impression, the photography of those events, that they were like the leaders and that they were the ones who found things and understood things and classified things. And it gave the impression that the Egyptians, the local Egyptians, they were just manual laborers whose only contribution was to dig and to carry the soil. But actually, what they were saying in this TV program is that it was those local people who also had knowledge about maybe where to look, what things might mean, how things compare to other things that have been previously covered. But according to that TV program, and this is just one example amongst many, those people were not given the credit that they deserved because basically, because they were Egyptians, they were just seen as unimportant. And this is a shame because, like I said, why would you not? If you're a scholar, like we claim to be scholars, we claim to be knowledge seekers, truth seekers, why would you not listen to people from other places? And just briefly, because I can go on and on about this, I want to say one other thing, right, which is quite close to my heart, which is about what's happening in Iran at the moment. You know, like you said at the outset, right? It's a difficult time because it's a time of, celebration supposedly. But what really strikes me is the question of whether what is happening in Iran in terms of the bombing and the targeting of Iran, what would the reaction be around the world if this was to happen in other countries, like in European countries, for example? And some people are asking the question about like Ukraine, and they're asking the question, they asked before about Gaza, and they asked it about Iran, about what is the difference in terms of the suffering of the civilians? How and how come there's so much anger about one conflict but not about another conflict? And it's not because we have political biases or favoritism towards any government or politician or leaders. We're talking here about the civilians. And what doesn't make sense to me is how can it be that a community or a nation is so unimportant in the eyes of some people that when bombs fall upon their community, we don't seem to say anything. We don't seem to really care. We just get on with our lives. We just move on to entertainment shows. And I don't understand that because what we should really believe, I think, tell me if I'm wrong, I think we should believe that all civilians and all humans, regardless of their nationality, regardless of their race or their religion or their gender, etc., all humans are valuable and all humans should be respected and cherished. And a life is so valuable. It's not, we can't just say, oh, there was 10 civilians killed or 20 civilians killed. Like, this isn't acceptable. This is not acceptable at all. So this is bothering me because it's showing me, or potentially it's showing me, that there's a double standard when it comes to which lives matter and which lives do not matter. I remember one of the movies, sorry, this very final thing, I'm sorry to take up a lot of time, that one of the movies that I really enjoyed back in the day is a movie, it's called Black Hawk Down. And I enjoyed it from an action kind of perspective before I really understood politics and colonialism and history and things. But even when I was watching that movie and understanding the action and I was a bit politically naive, I remember this is a movie, by the way, which is about an American sort of mission in Somalia, and I think it was set in the 90s. When they went with helicopters to, like, I can't remember, they want to arrest somebody or capture somebody or rescue somebody, something like that, and the mission goes wrong, and then there is a conflict and lots of shooting and stuff. Anyway, from an action point of view, this movie is very exciting and I really enjoyed it. But from a political point of view, I always recalled, and I could understand this even when I was politically naive, that in the final scene of the movie, at the end of a movie, they put like a summary because it's based on a true story. And I remember, I can't remember word for word because it's been many years since I watched this movie, but you can check it out if you're interested. The final credit says something like, on that day in, Mogadishu in 19 whatever, I can't remember the exact details, so this is just an example, but it says something like 22 American soldiers lost their life in battle. And then it says something like, 1,000 Somalis died or something like that. And that struck me at the time, even though, I was a young person watching this and I was like not aware of what was going on. And I thought that's interesting how it's the different explanation as to what happened to the American soldiers and what happened to the Somali people. And the impression that you get, or the impression I got, I'm not sure if you would also get that impression, is that, you know, you could tell who's the good guys and who the bad guys are. You could tell whose lives mattered and whose lives didn't matter. So here we're talking about this thing of valuing people in very significant consequential terms like war and violence and killing and bombing and all these terrible things. But where it all, and this is really important to talk about, but where it also happens, and this is what we often talk about in the university, is on the, as they call it, the epistemic level, or you could call it the knowledge level. And that's where we also worry that not only are people in terms of like, like what's it called in Cuba, like, you know, in the situation that they're in now, or even in Sudan, or, you know, in any other place, like not only in terms of the physical suffering that people are enduring because of war or embargoes or blockades, but also we talk about it on the level of knowledge, because not only are some lives, it appears, you tell me please if I'm wrong and if you disagree with this, but it seems that some people, their value is not as much as other people, and this affects the reaction when people are physically harmed, but it also affects the reaction when people want to speak and when people want to be heard and when people want to share their knowledge. So we're interested in both of these things because both of these components are part of the way in which there's this global inequality to do with which lives are considered as precious and which are not. I'll stop there.
Black Hawk Down as a text for analysis, I think it shows off a lot around your use of Edward Said and perhaps the cultural imperialism that he wrote so beautifully about. Because of course, what happens in the world of entertainment, and Hollywood is prime in the way it promotes this, legitimizes the political struggles that we engage in differently. And so of course, lives are constructed entirely differently through fiction and those sorts of narratives. And yes, it is about the epistemic struggle. And so, Gabriela, I'd like you to think a little bit more around how your work and shows that coloniality doesn't only shape what we think, but who gets to think out loud, who makes sense, who's intelligible. And if you don't mind saying a little bit more about language itself, is a site of epistemic struggle and what that means for researchers working in this space. If that's a point you'd like to pick up on, but anything else is fine.
Of epistemic and ontological struggle.
Onto epistemological, yep.
Because, and that's the one side where language, even if one wants to disrupt those understandings of the self that, you know, are themselves within the Western canon. But, you know, it's the ontological part that matters because so to say, you know, very briefly, so in my work, what I hypothesize and then theorize was that Europeans not only imposed their languages on the colonized, but their conceptualization of what a language is. So there was this Eurocentrically valorized expressivity from the get-go in their encounter with the during the first encounters of colonization until the present, right? Like this enormous epistemological, ontological, ideological apparatus that enable the colonial imagination to presuppose that colonized populations are linguistically and expressively non-human, right? Like, so when we think, and there is, you know, within Latin American decolonial thought is where race matters, right? Like, so as we understand that race is a fiction, right? Like there are, we also understand that racialization is the process that made that fiction real, right? That made people fit into the way the colonizer imagined them as such, right? So when we think race in these ways as a process of turning people into inferior, right? Like, you know, of course, when you were saying like, yeah, like there's, they compare 20 to 1,000, right? Like, and how is that balance, you know, that thing to that is completely unequal become equal, right? Like, so that's the part of transforming the Somali soldiers into, less than people, right? So I have done at looking at language itself, right? Like, and understanding that the connection between language, rationality, and humanity, right? Like, because the question of human and non-human was so core to at least the legacy of Latin America, right? Like the 16th century colonization, where an important question was whether the beings that they have encountered, right, could be evangelized, right? Like, so it was a religious question at the beginnings. Were there human and non-human, right? But even that question already entails the colonial perspective, right? So when it comes to language, what I came to study was the linguistic paradigm during the time of the conquest, right? And how human language, or language that is fundamentally human, was conceptualized, right? So then what happened in that moment was this articulation between the means of expressivity, and I have to say expressivity because I say language, my whole arguments goes down, right? So I'm saying that this philosophy of language name what a language is, and that naming left other expressivities outside. So only some expressivities count as human languages, and others no. So there was a process of racialization of people's expressivities, and giving, this idea of race understood as a human non-human distinction, right? Like, and this prescription, right, of the logic of coloniality, that said that to have a language entails expressing oneself in a manner that is rational, that it conforms to the Eurocentric colonial model of rationality that goes in hand with capitalism, right? Like some of the binaries that, Leon, you were talking in your comment, right? And why people, so when we think about subject, object, all those dichotomies that are so central to Western thinking, right? Like those are in the service of capitalism, in the sense that they produce a knowledge that is quantifiable, that is that there's an understanding of objectivity, all those elements that characterize Western rationality, also characterize the way the languages were the way of making sense was perceived and continues to be perceived. So because at the time, in the colonial times, indigenous people did not conform to what was understood now as a universal criterion of language, they naturally didn't have language, right? Like, so what matters in this way of understanding colonization, not just as Leon was saying at the beginning, right? Like, not just as an economic project, not just as a political project, but really a project of transforming people, of making them value less, their work to value less, right? Like their life to matter less, in the service of capitalism. So, and as a, I have looked at this in terms, not just in languages, as name language like English or Quechua, but also in people's ability to language, right? Like, and to make sense. So again, we see that the process of coloniality also is the process of like normalizing, norming the public space. Who has a voice? Who is a speaker, right? What is to speak properly? What is to speak politely? And then their feminism has also made an important contribution, right? Like in bringing at like the emotional to the question, right? To speak in a way that seems neutral, right? Like don't put your emotions, don't be angry. If you are angry, you stop making sense, right? Like so to understand that those or have all been mechanisms of colonization and alienation. Yes, to alienate ourselves from each other, to fragment ourselves from each other. So in a sense, mechanisms of hate, right? Of hate, that instilling hate, in us, learning to hate what is different, right? Like so, very much the task of decolonizing is like unlearning, right? Like Catherine Walsh says, we have to unlearn all these mechanisms that had been instilled of us, and then is when being centering and engaging knowledges, traditions, ways of living, ways of thinking, what is to the human matter, right? Like, because I was saying before, because it's not only the critique, right? We just don't critique for the sake of critiquing. We critique because we believe in social change, right? We believe in liberation, right? Like, and where what alternatives we can think, what we can think, right? Like because decolonization, we cannot think it as something that, is an event, right? Like it will happen, we will be decolonized, and now we start building again, right? Like it's not that eventual, right? Like it's more a process of transformation and imagination. So there again, questions of language, of communication, importantly of dialogue, right? Like many times we assume that because we are on the same side of things, right, we can make sense to each other, but that is really to ignore the power of oppression, right? So also is the process of learning also starts in being very aware of the assumptions we have as engaging with each other in critical conversations as this one.
Again, love what you were saying here in terms of rethinking our position and the way in which we focus on onto epistemological issues. But I want us to push ourselves a little bit more into thinking outside of the academy, and outside of the university, and outside of our papers that we write and the research that we do and so on, or perhaps maybe including the research we do. In public narratives and development work, in all kinds of places that we might find ourselves in education and health, etc. What would onto-epistemic justice look like? What would it look like outside in the so-called real world?
Just a parenthesis about the real world. I do think the academy is part of the real world. For me,
I agree with you.
the academy. So I understand your question. I think it's a very important question. But let's also disrupt that binary as well. I cannot think what to say to your question.
Okay. Leon, any thoughts on that? I mean, notwithstanding the critique.
Yeah, I mean, I guess the problem is because there's a lot of discussion about how to attain this, you could call it epistemic justice within the university. And I guess that makes sense because that's where supposedly knowledge is constructed and conveyed. But there is, of course, relevance beyond the university. And I think one of the ways in which this gets translated outside of the academic space is basically thinking about racism, because I think racism is a more accessible and commonly understood term, kind of, for the legacy of colonialism, that's a big component of it. It's not exactly interchangeable, and I think it's a little bit misleading when people use those two things interchangeably. And some people do that. They say, we need to decolonize, and in their mind, that means we need to be, against racism, and that is part of it. But the decolonial mission has other aspects to it beyond just targeting racism. Like we heard about, it could also be said to be about thinking of alternative ways of living and arranging and questioning in a much deeper way. It could be about rethinking things to do with language. Some people talk about reparations. Some people talk about renaming spaces and places and so on. But at least in one significant aspect of this whole decolonial project and the quest for epistemic justice and decolonial justice, I think it's about targeting racism. So what's the relevance of that? Of course, the problem is that racism is found in so many places in society, and it's sad. I mean, I was, at a football game today, like a youth football game, and the children, I didn't hear it myself, but one of the players told me that, one of the other players on the other team had made a comment to somebody else, like a racist comment, basically, which is really sad because these are young lads who, you always worry when you see it in the youngsters because there's quite a lot of effort these days in the schools to target racism and to challenge it, but somehow they're picking that up still and they're hearing it, whether it's at home or in online or wherever. But this is a question that if you as an attendee now are not in academia and you're not interested in academia, well, congratulations first of all, because we're all stressed and overwhelmed with too many emails. But if you're outside of academia, the question, and you want to do something to address these things, I think one question you can ask is, what is the presence of racism, and what can you do about that? Can you speak out? Can you do a campaign? Can you educate the younger people that you know in your life, whether your own children or your nephews, nieces? Can you talk about this? Can you raise awareness? And what's really significant, I think, is not only, and this is something that I'm kind of very passionate about, I think it's really important that we don't just talk about the racism that affects ourselves or our community. Like, I'm really big into this thing of unity across communities. So if, like, for example, I've written an academic paper which is about kind of, you could say, to simplify it, anti-Chinese racism, meaning racism or racist stereotypes towards Chinese people. So I'm not Chinese myself, and I don't have, Chinese heritage or anything. But I wanted to do that because I wanted to sort of like show to myself. I wanted to ask myself. I wanted to say, Leon, do you care about racism, or do you just care about yourself and your own people? Like, are you willing to talk about the type of racism that doesn't, like, it's not, you're not invested in it, it doesn't affect you? And so I am passionate about that. Like, I do believe that if you see some type of racism directed towards a community that's not your community, if that doesn't bother you, and if it only bothers you when it's about your community, personally, I'm not really, I don't think that's the best approach, because I believe that all of these things are interconnected. And if let's say we eradicated one type of racism and one of the minorities became a model minority, it doesn't free the rest of this community. And so we must try, I think, I'm sorry if it sounds a bit like preachy, but we must try to do what we can. And this is just something that personally I'm passionate about. But I think, yeah, this is an example maybe that is relevant to people beyond the university, because the crux of the matter is it's the racist stereotypes and assumptions which can even infiltrate anybody who's brought up in any society where these things exist, which is pretty much everywhere. And it's these racist sort of assumptions that become embedded to the extent that they affect not only how people get treated, but as I said earlier, how people are valued, whose opinion is considered as worthy, who is invited to speak, who is seen and who is invisible, and so on. So yeah, I hope that's the type of thing that you were thinking about.
Absolutely. And I think what's critical in what you've just raised is something that Nelson Mandela, and I've got a quote, the good man from way back when, said about Palestine. In famous quotes by now, he said, "We know too well that our freedom is incomplete without the freedom of the Palestinians." And he wasn't speaking specifically about the case of the country itself, but looked at, really emphasizing what would be the indivisibility of liberty and supporting the Palestinian struggle against occupation, but for all of us. And so I find that thought quite seductive for many reasons, because yes, you're right, we might be on a daily basis get too caught up in our own struggles without recognizing the need to belong in a world that that shares some of these struggles with us. So thank you for raising that. I'm gonna look at just going back a little bit to what we started naming at the beginning of this the session, but what was happening in the world today, and I want to bring it back into the room. Decolonial language has become, in some hands, a kind of branding. So, decolonize your curriculum, decolonize your inbox, decolonize yoga, decolonize everything. But meanwhile, actual colonial violence continues. And sometimes this happens what's narrated and justified by the very states that use the language of liberation. Now, Gabriela, in your prep notes, because I saw it for today, you wrote about the challenges facing researchers when decolonial struggles are live and contested. So what do you think our responsibility is, not in the abstract, but right now, today, given what is happening? And thank you, Leon, also for responding to the comments around the language that's been used in our panel today. So I'm sure, Gabriela, you've seen the comment about looking at all the participants and maybe speaking or referencing language that may be understood across the sectors. So the question is the challenges that are facing researchers when decolonial struggles are live and contested. And what do you think our responsibility is? You're on mute.
Mute. I was first thinking about, that the danger, right? Like the danger of being co-opted, right? Like when the term is co-opted and it's used to name things that, don't empty of meaning and importantly, disempower a term, right? Like, so, but I think that yes, with the colonial can be co-opted, but it can be co-opted like anything else to a certain extent. So for me, what is important is that that doesn't exhaust what the colonial perspective is. And I think that that's what should matters to us as the colonial research, right? Like a little bit like echoing your question, Mershen, like how do we continue enriching the discussion and sharpening the critique? I think that that's my quick answer to your question. So very attentive to the miseries, right, of the academia, but also attentive that miseries of the academia, that miseries of the university, that do not consume us completely, right? Like that is don't take over us, right? Like those that discussion. So for me, our role today and our responsibility, has to do with creating possibilities for developing anti-racist, anti-patriarchal, anti-sexist, critical consciousness, right? Like, and look, I'm saying critical consciousness that Freire used, 30 something years ago, right? Like, but that, so for me, that effort, if you want, one thing that responsibility has to do about is a constant an effort that requires like a constant critical self reflection, right? In our research practice. So echoing some of the preoccupations that Leon was bringing up regarding citation, right? Like, but even making the question a little bigger, right? Like with this, with the understanding of our place, right? Of enunciation, of making sense, from where, those we study, right? Like, so, because yes, I agree with what Leon was saying and putting it in my own terms, right? Like you see researchers that study indigenous languages, really, but they do it so from nowhere, right? Like that idea of the researcher being like in this kind of ahistorical, apolitical, neutral position to observe, right? Like without any contact or without any interest in the living speakers of that language, or even any awareness of their own position within the history of the colonization of that language, right? Like, so developing a deep sense of our place of enunciations when we are working with a problem is an important exercise, I think, to do, right? Like not only what knowledge we produce, but also where that knowledge comes from, like Leon was emphasizing. What is it for whom is it for, in conversation with whom it is produced, right? So it's a valuable, I think, exercise that we can do not only in our classrooms and in our studies groups, right? Like, but in for the people that are in the chat and saying we are not from the academia, right? Like in your groups of conversations, in your moments of reflection, I think it's an important exercise to do collectively, right? Like where are we standing, right? Historically and in relation to the hegemonic, and what tensions, right? Like I think sometimes people say, oh, such and such is a hypocritical, right? Like I think that it's important to be patient with each other, right? Like, and think, okay, we inhabit tensions, we inhabit contradictions. Capitalism doesn't make things easy, right? So I think that moment of self-reflection of where we are standing and who we are is an important issue in the work that we do. Also, I think a vital issue in this negotiation, right, of our roles in the academy, or not and disrupting some of the academy's mechanisms of oppression, is about company, right? The company we seek, who sees us and how they see us, right? So, and sometimes those, as Leon was bringing up with the question of racism, are difficult conversations to have, right? So it's not all nicey, right? Like we have to allow ourselves a level of honesty that sometimes is problematic and people are not ready for it, right? And so who sees us, who listens to us, who do we listen with one sense of our dialogical possibilities, and how we bridge, right? Like the non-dominant difference of Audre Lorde. How do we keep open spaces for dialogue? That those differences. Again, understanding that those spaces of dialogues don't exist, right? Like that this conference, like, and what Leon was saying at the beginning, and I didn't have my time to appreciate this space, right? As a space of criticism that has to be built by many people and sustained by many people. So I think that some of those are elements of responsibility in our daily doing, whatever is the doing that we do, if we do academic doing or non-academic one.
So, Thank you for those contributions, and I appreciate the positionality and the need to look at where we are, literally. But I want us to be a little bit honest with each other um, about the way in which the notion of the word decoloniality has been used. It's become its own kind of fashion. It's a buzzword. It's a performance. So how do we keep ourselves accountable? How do we tell the difference between the real thing and the branding? Um, Essentially, what I'm asking us to think about is how do we make sure that we're not just replacing one set of rigid thinking with another, but also the whole notion of performing the doing of decoloniality versus other ways of understanding it. So any thoughts on that? And maybe Leon, you can kick us off with thoughts around doing decoloniality, the performance nature of it.
Well, this is extremely important because, as you rightly say, there is a danger that we become a bit self-righteous and self-congratulatory, and we, claim to be doing great things, but really we're just talking the talk, but not walking the walk, as they say. So we need to, as they say, put your money where your mouth is, or I guess to put it another way, the way I think about it is like, what sacrifices are we willing to make? And if we're not willing to make those sacrifices, and if it's more like just an academic exercise in the sense that we just find this interesting, I think it's important to be honest about that and just accept that and admit that. And in a way, there's no shame in that. If you find it interesting to think about things, but you're not really going to do anything about it, just say that. Like, it's better to do that than to say, I'm like a revolutionary and I'm like changing the world. And I mean, there's things like you can do. Like, for example, if you are an academic, and I'm sorry if others are not academics, but those of us who teach, like, teaching students can be quite important in, having an impact on the world. But I know lots of academics, and I'd probably say most academics I know, and this is, I'm sorry if this is either not true or disappointing, but most academics don't like teaching. And most academics, and my judgment of them, I might be wrong, but my judgment, and this doesn't apply to me, of course, but most academics find students like a burden who are getting in the way of their desire to, write things and publish things. And that's a shame because like teaching is such a privilege, it's such an honor. And when you do it with sincerity and when you do it like with commitment, it's extremely rewarding, and it's about building relationships. And you know, when they graduate, and then some of them will come to you and say, thank you for this or that, or something you said, it changed my life, it opened my mind, I didn't even know that. And you didn't know you had that impact at the time. You were just like now, we're sharing a few things. But you just being able to speak, like we've given this privilege today to be able to speak and say all these things, it's a massive honor. So how do you be sincere in your decolonial work? Well, one way is put your heart into it with sincerity and make sacrifices, because to teach well is to make sacrifice, because to teach well is to actually care about the student, to see where they're at, to try and like, really listen to them and really get them and really make time for them. And sometimes you make extra time than what is required of you, because we have a limited time and we only have to do so much. But sometimes when we can help a student, especially a student who needs that extra support, we try to do that, especially if society hasn't been kind to them. We try and do that in a way which means that we're making a sacrifice. And I wrote this thing like, and I call it decolonial reflexivity. And reflexivity basically means looking within and asking yourself, like, how do you as an individual fit into the broader system and the broader structures that are surrounding you? Like, how are they impacting you and how are you impacting them? In other words, don't just assume that you're separate from society and you're looking at society, but recognize what your position is in society and in these relationships. And so this reflexivity, I believe, is something that we should be continuing to do. If even if if you're an activist, it's the same thing. You must, and it's not only if you're an activist. I guess it's important for anybody who has a role where they're trying to, do something, and they might fall into the trap of thinking they're doing it well. Even like, let's say, being a driver, driving a car. If you drive a car, you could say you should be reflexive, meaning you should take a moment every now and then to ask yourself, am I driving in the best way? You know, am I holding the steering wheel correct or dangerously? Am I indicating in the right way? Or, sometimes you shouldn't just get into the habit and get into the routine and it becomes second nature. Like a good driver is reflexive at some moments, meaning they pause at some point and they reevaluate their performance. They reevaluate how they're affecting other road users, if they're jeopardizing pedestrians. So this could apply in many scenarios. But what we're trying to do is, as so-called activists or so-called, some people are decolonial scholars or whatever, we need to pause from time to time and go, is what I'm doing the best way of doing it? Am I, is this just for me? Have I become arrogant? How many academics I've met who are so arrogant, probably including myself, where they've been in these conversations so long that they lost the ability to recognize that they might be wrong, that they might not know stuff. And so we need to check in with ourselves from time to time, or maybe continually. And that is what helps us, I think, potentially to get to a more sincere effort that is actually impactful and which is not tokenistic and which is not superficial and which is not self-serving. But it's a constant battle that maybe we'll never fully achieve because at the end of the day, and I say this often, out of all the decolonial scholars I've met, I never met one who either was willing to resign from their academic post because, the coloniality of the university, or who was willing to give back the qualification that they attained from a academic institution which was most likely founded upon and sustained upon a colonial legacy. And that's why I always say that those people who are in universities who call themselves decolonial scholars, and maybe this applies to me, we're part of the system and we benefit from the system. And so we should be hesitant about depicting ourselves as revolutionaries because at best, we're reformers. Not reformers in the sense of the UK. I don't know if you know, there's a political party called Reform in the UK, and that's not what I mean. We seek reform. We don't seek revolution, although sometimes we like to depict ourselves as revolutionaries. And I'm not saying that revolution is necessarily better than reform. Maybe we're comfortable with reform because maybe we feel within the university and within societies there is a lot of good things happening and a lot of good things worth saving. And maybe we just want to change and improve things rather than abolish it. But there are people out there who actually want to abolish universities and defund, as they say, universities. So, but that's a more radical perspective, which most decolonial scholars, I think, are not really calling for. Not those who are in the university. Maybe there are those out of the university who are more radical and who really want to decolonize. But the type of decolonization that academics are calling for me, it's more like reform. And I'm not saying that about others. I'm including that I could include that to myself, and I could be rightly critiqued by those who are outside of the university for being part of that system. So even if you try with sincerity, to go back to your question, to do something which is meaningful, yes, I believe you can do that, but there'll always be a limit to that because we're still you could say, begging to retain a job in a system which is part of this, and we have to do things that we might not like to do in terms of the way that we have to publish and the way we have to communicate and the metrics that we have to adhere to. We're part of the system, and that means we'll always be limited in what we can do as long as we're part of these institutions.
Yeah, I agree with the way you positioned reform and evolution and the role of people like researchers and academics in the academy. Because no matter how cool we think we are, smoking a joint or being in the mainstream, we're still doing it in the school toilets, and we're still part of that. So that whole way of resistance is still very much within that organizational structure. So 10 out of 10 for raising that. Thank you. Gabriela, any thoughts on the issue? Any points you'd like to add to that?
Yeah, let me think a little bit because as I was saying before, I think that the decolonial, like any other perspective, uh, 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 way of approaching something, term can be co-opted and has been co-opted, right? Like I do sometimes made the comment of the decolonial shampoo, for example. But again, I think that as we pay attention of that misery of the academy, right? Of that commodification of knowledge, let's not get exhausted by it, right? I think that there's something, because I'm a decolonial scholar, and I like to say that I'm a decolonial, and it's 20 years of this way of thinking, this way of teaching, this way of making research against the grain of colonization and coloniality. Why I want to be in the university? Because as Rita Segato used to say, right, like because the Black and brown students that come to the university, because they come to the university. So that's why I want to be in the university, because the university is one, like the school, is one of the most powerful mechanisms of assimilation that there exist. So it's important that we are in there to give our students those antidotes against assimilation, antidotes against the whitewashing of their brains, because capitalism is extremely powerful. So it's important that our struggle is also inside the classrooms, like Freire has taught us since the 80s, and before him, right? Like, so as I was saying, my struggle has been within the academy, and indeed, I have had the privilege to have worked with the maestros and maestras, as we say in Spanish, right, of anti-colonial, anti-racist thinking, and to learn from their resistance in paper and in the flesh. And I have the fortune to have inhabited institutional spaces that were already cracked, right? Like they were already shattered by my maestros and maestras, by feminists of colors, by decolonial thinkers, by intercultural translators, by theorists of dependencies, right? Like all, and the cracks that they make in the walls of the academy are weak, right? They're just cracks, but they are very spirited, right? And I I inhabited those spaces and looking, in the cracks of those spaces, right? Like as survivors of Eurocentric violence, right? I think I see myself as a survivor of alienation and Eurocentrism, and like as a survivor of any addiction is like, it's like the recovery from addiction, right? Like is a battle that is a never stopping struggle, right? Like every day, right? Like one day at a time, like recovery programs put it, right? Like because there's always the temptation, for me, for example, the temptation is that mirage of passing as white, right? Like given the way you may look at me, but like it's for me, it is about the cracks, right? Like those cracks in the wall, and propagating the weeds, right? Like the plants that are supposed to be undesirable in those little cracks in the wall. So I that is how I have experienced my journey within the academy, when I was a student, when I was a researcher. Now I'm back in the classroom, and it's where I think where you put your energies, because to tell you the truth, Mershen, I know that people can know immediately the trend from the social, the social justice effort, right?
Mm-hmm.
It's very evident when, as Leon was saying, people don't care, right? So and to care it sometimes is problematic, right? Like you ask yourself, should I care about this, or am I appropriating something, right? Like all those doubts that we overthink sometimes, our permissions, right? And I think that is also a way that we are entangled not to do anything, right? Like to stay in our little boxes, in our niches, and talk to the same people, right? Like and things are being extremely difficult to build trust, right? Like before we were talking a little bit in terms of solidarity, right? And I think Leon, where you were talking about when we encounter a person in situation, in homeless person, as you were saying, right? Like and there's a theologist of liberation. Her name is Ada Isasi Diaz. She lived in the United States. She was Cuban, and she did work on what she called mujerista theology. And one of the important parts of her theology was really to rethink what solidarity is, right? Like away from the idea of charity, right? Away of the idea of this kind of like something you turn on and off disposition, right? Like where you feel sympathy for people, and think of solidarity really in the terms that you were citing, Marshall, echoing Mandela, right? Like to think solidarity in the terms that I'm not fully human if other people are not fully human, right? Like because humanity is always dialogic, right? So in those terms is I think ways of thinking of our work, not to dismiss the criticisms of cooptation. I insist, I'm not dismissing them. I just want to make sure that we just don't get trapped in them. And as they say in English, throw the baby with the water, right? Like because the colonial scholars have done an important work of giving us, you know, foundations of critical theory, vocabulary, reflections that sometimes we are not able to do. So also to validate the important work that my maestras and maestros have done.
Yeah, I love the reference to solidarity and us thinking critically about solidarity. I want us to reflect a little bit on how, and because we talked about the global South, how this might be understood as a unified thing. So that notion of solidarity there, which, if we were to be honest, and we've already mentioned this, is that in many ways, just as much as the story is how we tell the idea of the West as being one unified thing, the reality is messier. So there are real tensions between how Africa and Latin America, for example, understand race differently, between big emerging economies and smaller nations throughout those continents, throughout Asia, whose interests don't always align between the wealthy and the poor people within the same country or the same space or the same region. So we're not all, together in this thing in the same way. We share different ways of doing this. So this is really for both of you to think through around, and perhaps even our people, participants and audience members. Where have you found real, genuine solidarity in your work? And where have you found it mostly wishful thinking? So if you had to explore and help us understand what genuine solidarity looks like, that would be useful for us to know how to understand this, just learning from your experiences.
Well, if I can start, I think, and because I mean, the work I do most is about dialogue, right? I think it's first of all, if it's a disposition, right, to some of the elements that Leon also was bringing, of honesty, in regards to what we don't know, of being uh, okay to being uncomfortable. For me, that's the first step of solidarity, not to assume it, right? Not to assume that because, as I said before, we are on the same side of things, now we have solidarity, right? Like we are going to go, that there's, and even think, right? Like, and I like you're talking about solidarity, because solidarity, I think that we are always, we don't question why do we need it. Sometimes I do question the need for unity, right? Like the need to think for a large unity. Then, because for me, and that's my, because of being a philosopher, some words are weighted, right? Like, and unity for me has too much weight of purity and homogeneity and sameness, right? So it's a word that I sometimes I react to it, because it could, for, I hear it always with a totalitarian ring to it. So but I think when we think of solidarity, has to do also with that, right? Like that not only openness, right? Like, but being okay with what is maybe disturbing and challenging. So yeah, let me stop there, because I'm just thinking on my feet. I don't know if I'm making sense. So I let me think a little.
You are. Can I just ask you to maybe describe, even if you can't name, an example of something where that's happened in your work specifically? I know you're talking through the notion of trust and unity, etc. But any examples of practically where this has happened?
Well, as I was saying before, like, vital things as I'm in decolonizing our work has to be with company, right? Like, and for me, that company until before the pandemic, that having that company of interlocutors, of, compañeros and compañeras that help you and to make sense collectively, right? Like, because making sense just to ourselves is not making sense, right? Like, again, sense is always in that. So I building a space that is multi-voice, multi-gender, where we could ask questions of things that we didn't know, without guilt of not knowing it. For me,
Mm.
yeah, there was, a research center that I belonged for many years, had that element of solidarity. And then right now, I will say, continues to be feminist spaces, right? Like, so, say at work, when the Latina faculty gets together, right? Like, and those are spaces of, because I work on a university that doesn't allow us to unionize, right? So we have to kind of build our own way of having each other's back, right? Like, because for me, another way of saying solidarity is that. It's not like, oh, nice, it's not like giving a like on Insta, right? Like that is what Isasi Diaz was saying. That's the co-opted solidarity, right? Like saying, oh, applauding for something, but as Leon was saying, not standing up to change it, right? Like, and it doesn't have to be, I don't think part that for me, also Western thinking has with the idea of revolution is that we have too much marks in our head, right? Like, and we think, oh, the revolution comes and everything change, right? Like, and not to think of the process, right? Like, so for me, solidarity has to that with that disposition to for social change, right? And I think that that's something that somehow you immediately see in people. That doesn't mean that you understand them, right? Like, but there is something, a disposition that you see, and that could be the first moment of solidarity, right? Like when you sit down and start learning each other's locations, each other's struggles, and really listening, right? Like learning, because so that I would say those are some elements of solidarity that I have experienced in both research groups and feminist collectives.
Leon, I'm actually going to ask you to respond to a slightly different version of the question I asked because I think you might have some useful ideas around this. I think for most of the communities across the global South majority world, it's not like they've been sitting around waiting for permission to think about things like anti-racism or race and power, etc. And you know that because I've read in your work that you recognize the value of what people have done for eons in their own spaces in the global South. And they've been doing it in their own languages, from their own histories and their own terms. So if you had to look at the notion of anti-racism, look at what happens when it grows up from your context, your tradition, your community. Yeah, I'd like thoughts about what happens when you think that gets lost or distorted. Now, perhaps to speak about it through your own life experiences i- of being in another country, and thinking about frameworks that get ignored or how they get translated into Western academic language, and how attempts at those things getting taken seriously are often distorted, perhaps. So just talk around what does anti-racism look like from when it grows up in your context?
Well, your question is very rich and it requires more thought, so I'm not sure I can adequately answer what you've just mentioned. But I think it relates to what I was going to say to the previous question anyway.
Hmm.
Because when you asked like about examples of solidarity, I was kind of disappointed that it wasn't easy for me to think of examples, and I'm not sure if that's because I'm pessimistic or because we're not doing as good a job as we could be doing. But two things came to mind, and I think it relates to anti-racism as well, and how that is concocted in different contexts. So the first example, and I mentioned this in another event last week that happened to be at, so it's a coincidence that you've made me think about it again. But it was actually when I went to Melbourne, maybe 10 years ago now. And I remember I was just going there on holiday and I got there and on that day they had a protest which happened to be organized, which somehow I heard about when I arrived. And the protest was organized by, I think they're called Australia First, which, as far as I understand, I mean, some of you will understand them better than I do, but the agenda of this group is far right and very much against, as they call it, the Islamization of Australia. And so, I was on holiday. I was supposed to be relaxing, but of course, the instinct is to go down and check it out and see what's going on. So I went down to see what's going on and to understand more about the discourse in Australia and the types of debates and all that kind of stuff. And what I found was something that, really inspired me because I found a counter protest, right? Those protesting against this Australia First far right group. And this group who'd come to protest like against Muslims in Australia was met by a group of people who, when I looked at them, you never know, of course, what people's true belief is in their heart and so on, but they didn't appear to be Muslim. They didn't appear to be from the Muslim community. But the way they were protesting was full of passion and it's risky. It's not easy to go and protest against groups who are quite, um, quite sort of aggressive. But these people went out there, their face was visible, their voice was loud. And, I was saying in the event the other day that I can still hear, even though it's been 10 years, I can still hear the chants that they were chanting, and I can still see the guy's face who was leading this protest. And the chant that they were saying in response to those, you could say, Islamophobic protesters, they were saying, always has been, always will be, Aboriginal land. And I don't know if that's a common chant that's still sung today or if that was just for that particular occasion, but I can still hear it in my head after 10 years. And like I said, what struck me, and it relates to what I said earlier, is like I was looking at them and I was like, why are these people here? Their community's not being attacked. What has this got to do with them? Why are they putting themselves on the line in a dangerous situation? Lots of police were present. You never know how things are going to kick off, what direction it's going to go. You have to travel home at the end of the day. People come with cameras, big cameras, taking pictures of people, putting them online, saying things about them. It's not without risk. So that was a moment for me that really like educated me in what solidarity means. So when I said earlier about the importance of standing up for other communities, a lot of it comes from that act of solidarity that I witnessed in Australia, which made me realize, oh my God, what are we doing? Like, of course, like if you're a Muslim, you might go and protest against Islamophobia, but what are you willing to do when another community is being attacked? Because these people showed me that's possible. So that was one manifestation of anti-racism, which really inspired me. And then the other thing that came to mind, and I'm not sure, like, what your participants think about this, but it's about religious pilgrimage, because as you'll probably know, for Muslims, there is a religious pilgrimage to Saudi Arabia, or not, well, to Mecca, which is a city in Saudi Arabia, which is, the you could say the birthplace of Islam, and the Black Stone, as they call it, or the Kaaba is there, and Muslims will go there in various times of the year and do a religious pilgrimage. And this is, Malcolm X brought a lot of attention to this because it was famously a place where he went and it changed his whole conception about unity and race and solidarity and togetherness. And I've had the sort of privilege of going there myself, and it's true. I think I can see where he's coming from in the sense that that's a place, and I imagine it exists. It also is the same for other forms of religious pilgrimage. That's a place where you go, and because of what you have to wear and how you have to move and what you're doing, it's a place where it really can, depending on how you want to look at it, help you rethink all of those hierarchies that we've established, and rethink the pettiness of them and how ridiculous it is that because somebody's rich, Benjamin Zephaniah, I don't know if you know him, he's a poet from the UK. He passed away a couple of years ago now. He's a great poet, and he has this poem called Money. And he said in that, it's not like I always read poetry, by the way. I'm sounding like I'm some poetic kind of person. I'm not. But he had a line in that poem, which you can find it on YouTube if you want to check it out. It's called Money. His name is Benjamin Zephaniah. And he said, a brother doesn't want to speak to a brother because a brother is poor. This is like a line that also sticks with me, and it's so pathetic, but he put it so well, and it's so simple that some people don't want to speak to somebody else just because they're poor, and because they're poor, they're supposedly irrelevant. And in that context of the religious pilgrimage, to some extent, and it's obviously not, we don't want to over romanticize things, but to some extent, that's a space where it is anti-racism in a context where people might not realize that they're engaged in the practice of anti-racism, but it's anti-racist because we're all in it together, we're all doing certain rituals together, and we're all wearing the same clothing like together. And there is to some extent to some extent, I don't want to like say be too idealistic, because there is still, like, for example, there was an incident of someone approaching me and asking for money, and then the same person the next day, like, there's some, you could call it like a scam potentially that was occurring. So it's not like everyone there is righteous and perfect and there's no crime or no manipulation or hatred or hostility. Of course, people are people, and that will happen everywhere, but it's one of the most enlightening spaces that I've felt. There is another possibility of doing something where we almost, I can't say we definitely did, but we almost stepped out of the global order and the historical frameworks that have been constructed, and we almost traveled. And maybe you can attain it more if you're more spiritual than me, and if you can really like go into another zone. But it's almost possible in that space, and maybe in other religious spaces, and maybe other spaces that I'm not aware of, secular spaces, to transcend the historical baggage by finding yourself in a place which is almost like another world, because it's so different from reality. It's so different from how you normally live in your day-to-day life, the things that you're doing, the way that you're surrounded by people, the expectations, what is prioritized, what is not prioritized. It's almost like going to the moon. You're in like a different world where you've stepped out of the normal the globe, like the international airport culture, which is the same everywhere in the world. You're stepping out of the global order into a very unique space, which is not, it just doesn't correspond. I mean, it depends on how you engage in it, because the other thing that's quite interesting is that there are malls and restaurants in the vicinity. So some people might be going there for the shopping, and in that sense, they're still very much in the system. But other people who are really going for that spiritual dimension, it's something that it's quite interesting when you not many people I've not really seen people putting these two things together, like decolonization and religious pilgrimage, but maybe there's potential there for other people who are more aware of these things to take that further.
And I think those are great examples, actually, Leon. Thank you for sharing them because they've opened up a whole new space to think about solidarity. I'm just looking at the time, and there's some beautiful questions in the Q&A, and I think if we can maybe select a couple of them to respond to. Um, One of them, I think we inadvertently answered it without naming it, was looking at the doctrine of discovery, and thinking about how that's um, sort of helped us to reflect around our engagement with the global South. So I'm wondering if maybe that we've dealt with notions of that, even though we haven't named it, in this talk. But there's some other interesting ones that I would like us to look at least one of this, which says, well, firstly, this thank you for your Mahi, your work on the intellectual frontline, and how can academics position ourselves as more useful and relevant in terms of global decolonization movement? In other words, how can you be an activist scholar, perhaps? Any thoughts on that?
Well, I think I have been, talking about that for a while now. I maybe the what I would like to add, and in echoing a little bit of what's been saying about anti-racism. Now that is if we are scholars, right? Like if we if our doing, if what we do, right, is scholarship work, right? Like either research, curricula, teaching, right? We understand that doing, like everything that we do, is racialized, right? Like that is, I think, for me, one of the important understandings of that for me comes from Latin American decolonial theory, right? Like that understanding of race, not limited to skin color, but really a way of classifying people and what people do for the sake of capitalism and white supremacy, right? So for me, the first thing is understand how we are ourselves and our work wears those marks of subordination, right? Like, so it is about critique, right? Like, and the critique is important because it's, as I was saying before, because the cracks in the walls are a process, right? Like the building is not gonna come down, and even if it doesn't come down, like to tell you the truth, I have always said that as a colonial institution, similar to the state or the prison, I don't think the university as an institution can be decolonized, right? Like, but it is in the space of the classroom or in the space of our office hours, or like it's in the space that we can inhabit it and crack, where our decolonizing possibilities exist. Because it's the verb, right? Like it's to decolonize. It's not so much an adjective or a badge that we put in ourselves. Like, maybe sometimes during the conversation it sounds like that, but at least it's not, right? Like it's not like an adjective, right? Like it's a task, right?
Absolutely. And thank you for that. Those are beautiful sound bites that I think we're going to have to close the session on. So, Leon, if there's anything else you'd like to add to that, perhaps maybe in the chat as well, because it's going to be visible afterwards. And that's an abrupt ending, but I just want to say thank you to our panelists, to Leon, to Gabriela. What you brought to this conversation today was generous, it was honest, and at several points usefully uncomfortable. And that's exactly what we came for. So thank you. Thank you also to Storm and the tech and volunteer team who held the session together. And thank you for the roughly 35 organizations who are backing up this conference. So thank you very much once again. And I'm sure that everyone's enjoyed it as much as I have. Thank you. Thanks for attending the session.